Okay, so as Shabir said, I'm talking about the labour theory of value, and what I'm going to try and do is kind of, I'm going to try and make this sort of unmysterious for people like me who aren't economists. So, I don't know about this because I've studied economics. I know about this because I'm a Marxist and I've read what Marx says and what other people say about what Marx says. So I'm going to try. This is kind of a sort of a layperson's introduction. So I'm going to focus on what the political consequences are rather than the kind of details of some of the rather abstruse economic debates about it. So so the first question obviously is, okay, we're talking about labour theory of value, so what is value? So I mean, that might seem obvious that something is worth something, but when you look at actually what some of the economic debates are about this, actually that's kind of it's a matter of some dispute, because some mainstream economists and some Keynesian economists actually think that there isn't any such thing as value. So this person called Joe Robinson, who writes a lot about sort of Keynesian economics, calls it a mysterious emanation still lurking in relative prices. So what that means is that a lot of mainstream economists think that there is no intrinsic value in anything. It's all just about how much you can get someone to pay for it. So there's not, so if you could get, say, if you had this pen, and if I could get someone to pay £1 million for this pen, that would mean that the value of this pen would be £1 million. It's all purely that sort of supply and demand. So that can be quite confusing then when you're looking at what Marx thinks about value, because Marx disagrees. He says that there is an intrinsic value. And what that is in any commodity is that's the natural input. So again, in this pen, it's the oil and the plastic and so on, and the labour, which obviously turns the natural inputs into the commodity. But we need to sort of unpack that a bit, because what we're talking about is what Marx calls the socially necessary labour time to produce a commodity. And that's average across the economy. So you can't look at it at the level of individual commodities. You have to look at it as an average, which I'll come back to that point. So what is socially necessary labour time? Well, this is what makes the difference between something that you produce and a commodity that's for sale. So if I spent this afternoon after this Cadre School making a cake, so I spent 2 hours making this cake. If I just make it for me to eat, then okay, I have a nice late afternoon because I spent the afternoon eating my cake, but I'm not making it for other people to buy. So then that's not socially necessary labour time. That's just me spending my afternoon on baking. If I make it for other people to buy, then that's fulfilling a social need. And it's a social need because someone's prepared to buy it. So they must have needed cake, because we all need cake. So therefore that's socially necessary. So that makes the cake a commodity. So in that sense, we can regard commodities as crystallized social labor, is what Marx says. So that's an important distinction to start off with at the beginning. So the theory of value and how that works. Originally, this was an economist called Ricardo, and Marx kind of took his theory and transformed it, as Marx so often did. Like with Hegel standing on his head and putting right way up. In a way, he does almost the same with Ricardo. Because Ricardo, in a way, gets him. He's come up with the theory of value, which is very useful, but he gets himself into a real pickle with it because he thinks of it at the level of the original commodity. So it kind of works until you start unpacking it. So if we go back to the cake analogy. So if I take 2 hours to make the cake, then you could say, okay, well, the value of my labor, so the value in the cake that relates to my labor is 2 hours. So the value of the cake as a whole is the 2 hours plus the ingredients and so on. So okay, that sounds okay, that's all very sensible. We know what labor is. But then if you start thinking, well, what if I take 4 hours to make the cake rather than 2 hours? Does that mean that it's more valuable because it's taken longer? Well, it might, in a way, because if it's like, a sort of massive wedding cake that's got like 6 tiers or something, then yep, that might be, it's more elaborate. But what if I've just taken twice as long because I'm a bit crap? I keep forgetting what I'm supposed to do and I keep dropping the eggs and things. Does that mean it's more valuable? Well, I mean, that can't be right. That's nuts. So clearly that doesn't work if you're looking at it at the level of an individual commodity. And there's a kind of a getting away from my sort of Sunday cake obsession. I mean, there's other examples that economists come up and actually use as a way of disproving Marx's theory of value, it doesn't disprove Marx's theory of value, which is about products that have scarcity value. So an example is stuff called ambergris. which I'm told, I always think of it as whale vomit. I'm told very firmly by people who know a lot about whales that it isn't whale vomit, but it comes from whale stomachs or whale digestive tracts. So vomit will do, I feel. But basically, it sounds disgusting, and I'm sure it is, but it's actually very valuable because it's used in the perfume industry. But the thing is that it's quite scarce. So, but if you happen to be on the beach and you find some, then you yourself have not had to do very much work to find this. You know, you just see this pile of ambergris and you're like, oh, I'm quids in, because actually this is really, really valuable stuff. So the mainstream economists argue that, well, the labor in that is very small. So therefore it disproves the labor theory of value, because this stuff is incredibly valuable, but all you have to do is pick it up. But the point is, again, that this shows that it doesn't work at the level of individual commodities. It works as an average across the economy, because what you've, with the ambergris example, what you've got to think about in terms of how much labor is involved is not just the labor of the lucky person who finds it, but all the other people who walk along all the other beaches and don't find any ambergris. So that's why it has scarcity value, because it doesn't happen very often. So the labor actually, in that sense, is very great. So it only works if you're generalizing it. And that's the point. We have to think here as value. It's not a thing, it's a social relation. So we have to think of it at the social level rather than at the individual level. So what that little discussion there, I think, hopefully has made clear, is that this is not at all the same thing as price. So pricing strategies, if you've ever, as I had to do in my day job as training as an accountant, I had to do some modules about pricing strategies. And it's very, very complicated, and they fluctuate according to market conditions and all sorts of things. And you have, you know, strategies where you have loss leaders, and strategies actually where you charge more for something than you would think it would be worth, because people are more likely to buy it if they think it's expensive, because they think therefore it's good value and it's desirable and so on. So, you know, capitalist pricing is really complicated, and it really doesn't bear very much relationship at all to value. So it's really important to make that distinction. And even if you take out the kind of somewhat abstruse pricing strategies that modern companies use, and you just go back to, you know, prices, supply and demand, well, Marx points out that supply and demand doesn't actually really explain anything. Because at equilibrium, if you think of it as an equation, if your supply and demand are the same, at equilibrium, they should cancel each other out. But they don't, because there's always a price. And so that difference, he says, is basically the value. And Ricardo got himself kind of really tied up in knots, trying to work out how you could have a kind of a, you know, a linear, like an equation that would tell you how value transforms into prices. And again, because because this isn't at the level of an individual commodity, it doesn't work like that. You can't ever do that. You can't say, okay, there's always, you know, price is 2.47 times value. You know, Ricardo was trying to make it as a formula that you could predict what the price of an individual commodity would be, and you can't do that. And arguably, this is actually a reason why a lot of economists don't like Marxist theory of value, because they don't see the point in it. It's as if, you know, if you're sort of, you know, if you're into capitalism and you're an economist, really the whole point of what you're doing is so that you can predict prices. So it's almost like they're saying, well, if you can't use value to predict what the price of a specific commodity should be, would have been 10 years ago, should be, will be in 10 years' time, then what's the point? It's a completely valueless theory as far as they're concerned. So that's possibly, there's lots of attempts to try and make it relate to prices, and because they can't, it's kind of like, well, it doesn't really matter. And it's interesting, actually, I think that it's again, this is from sort of accountancy, but I often think that that a lot of sort of mainstream economists and indeed capitalists, you know, they don't value the theory of value because they can't see it. You know, if you have like a sort of company's statement of profit and loss and a balance sheet, you can't see value on there at all. You can see how much profit you made, but that's not the same thing. So again, it's something that it actually underpins the whole capitalist system, but capitalists themselves can't see it. They're not aware of it. So economists who are working within those sort of capitalist assumptions are just not getting it, in a sense. But again, because they're looking at it at the level of an individual commodity, individual profits for an individual company and so on, and that's not where value is. So obviously it's not the same as price. And it's also not the same as profit. But obviously, of course, capitalists are only interested in making a profit from their commodity production or for servicing commodity production and so on. So the question is then, well, where does the profit come from? Because obviously it's got to derive from value somehow, even though capitalists don't actually have ways of tracking that. And this is where surplus value comes in. This is what profit comes from. So, okay, so you probably heard the term surplus value bandied around, but not necessarily always that clear on what it is. Now, the surplus value is the value generated by the worker that the worker doesn't get paid for. Okay, so this is an important point. So workers sell their labor power, but their labor power is only limited by their active energies, their physical strength, for how long they can work for. And that distinction between labor and labor power is really important. So, I mean, it sounds like that might be a kind of a semantic distinction, but it's really not. It's really key to Marx's understanding of what value and surplus value is. So I'll try and unpack it, and I'm kind of using rather simplistic figures. So, but it's kind of necessary just to make the maths easier. So, okay, so if what you were selling is your labor, you would sell it for the value of your labor, and the value of your labor is related to the cost of reproducing your labor. So the cost of feeding yourself and having somewhere to sleep and so on and so on. So say if the cost of reproducing your labor for a day was 40 quid, and say in the job that you do, you can generate that amount of value in, say, 4 hours. So then you would sell your labor for £10 an hour. So you get the value of reproducing your labor, and that's all just what it works. And that's then keeping value kind of constant. But of course, that doesn't give the capitalist any profit. So they pay you 40 quid and they get 40 quid. So what's the point of that? There's no profit in that. There's no difference. Their outgoings are the same as what they're going to gain from it. But the point is that you're not selling your labor. You're not selling that 4 hours worth. You're selling your labor power. So maybe they can get you to work for longer. They can get you to work for 7 hours or 8 hours. Maybe they can make you work harder in the 4 hours, so they can get 8 hours worth of work out of you in 4 hours. And obviously that's to do with technological advances and so on, which we'll come back to in a sec. And the thing is, if they can make you work longer, or if they can make you work harder, they're not actually going to pay you for all of that extra work or that extra time. So maybe if they make you do an 8-hour day, they might pay you 50 quid for that. But then you're creating 80 quid of value. So that 30 quid that they've made that they haven't paid you is the surplus value. That's the work that the value that you've generated for them with your labor power that they aren't paying you. So what Marx says is that when the capitalist sells the product, he sells not only what it's cost him an equivalent, but he sells also what has cost him nothing, although it's cost the labor of his workmen. So that's the point. The surplus value is what they've got out of you that they haven't actually remunerated you for. So it's based on exploiting. It's based on taking value from the workers and not paying for it in that sense. And that's where the profit comes from. There's a really important point here is that only human labor creates surplus value. So as we talked about right at the beginning, other things create value. So obviously you have the natural inputs. If you're producing a thing, obviously there's the oil or the flour or whatever it is. So part of the value is from that. And you also obviously you use machinery and so on to make the products probably. So there's value there. But you can't exploit a bag of flour. A bag of flour, it's worth what it's worth. You can't create more value out of the bag of flour than is in the bag of flour. So the only thing that you can exploit, that you can get more value out of it than you pay for, is human labor. And that's really important, because that explains then the next bit, which is where you would think that the more human labor power goes into a particular commodity, the more surplus value comes out. And the thing is, it's like, in terms of this theory, that's correct. But if you think about it, industries where that are the most lucrative, the production that's the most lucrative, the production that's most profitable, is usually actually not the production that has high amounts of human labor, as opposed to machine labor in it. As if it was the case that it's just about how much human labor goes into anything, why would you mechanize anything? because you're not going to make profits if you mechanize it. So, okay, you could say, well, capitalists don't see where value comes from and so on. And to an extent, that's true. But clearly, there's something else happening here. So this is another example of how the labor theory of value works at the level of a totality rather than at an individual level. So what's going on is that because of capitalist competition, okay, so every capitalist needs to get the most productivity out of their workers as they can, and they need to keep wages as low as possible, because otherwise, obviously, their costs go up. And though technology is a way of doing both of these things. So say if, we watched Made in Dagenham reasonably recently. So my example here is, say if you have 50 people sewing car seat pieces together. So they're doing that, they're using sewing machines, but they're doing there's quite a high proportion of human labor going into doing that. If you were able to get rid of them and do this all kind of completely automatically, you might have one person, operating the machinery. So that one person would be producing a huge amount of surplus value in their time, because in a sense their labor power is covering all the work that the machines are going to do. So that person is very, very productive. And you will have, as a capitalist, you will have saved yourselves huge amounts of money, because you probably have to pay this person a bit more than you were paying the machinist, but not 50 times more. So you're saving huge amounts on your wage bill. But the human labor going into those commodities will be much lower. So in Marxist terms, you'll have a higher organic composition of capital, which is where you have a higher proportion of machinery, so machine work going into a particular commodities. So what's happening there is that the surplus value is being captured by capitalists who've moved to automation. So they're more profitable. So they aren't generating the surplus value themselves, because actually their organic composition of capital is higher, but they're able to capture the surplus value that's in the economy that ultimately is coming from sectors which are actually much less mechanized. So what Marx says is that he calls this capitalist communism. Because he points out the surplus value is distributed among capitalists not according to how much they generate, but according to how much capital they put in. So my Ford in Dagenham example, they've put in more capital, they've invested that in machinery. It's a very highly capitalized industry compared to the garment factories in Bangladesh, who are probably making the car seat pieces pretty much by hand in the first place. But Ford is able to capture that because they're able to make themselves more productive and more competitive. So they're getting back what they put in as capital and a bit more, not related to actually how much surplus value they're generating. So the sectors of the economy are kind of doing all the work in the sense of generating the surplus value, and that's being captured then by the capital intensive industries rather than the labor intensive industries one. And that is then part of how we can see the whole capitalist system works, because this is actually part of exploitation, not just of individual workers, but actually from the first world to the third world and so on. That example that Ford and its car seats, and they're extracting surplus value from probably Bangladesh, where the car seat pieces are made. I mean, this is again part of this, that the way that the value flows from the places where actually people are doing the work to the capital intensive parts of the world. So this is a kind of a dynamic that underlies imperialism and underlies unequal trade relations and so on. So basically what each country's economy wants to do is to move up the value chain, in a sense, to be one of the apex predators on the top of the pecking order who get to capture all the surplus value that's created elsewhere. But of course, the problem with that, apart from the really fundamental injustice of all of this, the problem with it for capitalism is that this is fundamentally unstable. And this is one of the reasons why capitalism is fundamentally unstable, because the higher organic composition of capital you have, so the more machinery you have as opposed to human labor, the more the rate of profit falls, because profit comes from surplus value. Ultimately, you can't just keep on sucking up everyone else's surplus value and putting that into your machines, because machines are dead labor. They're not going to actually generate any more surplus value for you. So the rate at which you make, so your actual profit, your balance sheet might look fine, but the rate at which you make profit will fall over time in a generalized way across the whole economy. So you can't necessarily say this one specific industry or this specific workplace is going to have that, it's going to be able to see this issue. But over time, the tendency will be for it to fall, which is why capitalism isn't a stable system, because individual capitalists proceeding logically in their own interest actually means that the system in the end stops working, and this is why it goes from crisis to crisis. So their individual interests are actually opposed to the interests of the capitalist class in general. So even before you introduced, well, the proletariats, us workers who are being exploited, and our interests are obviously diametrically opposed to those of the capitalists, actually the capitalist class itself. We kind of often talk about the capitalist class will work together in their own interest, but in a sense, in the economic terms, they can't, because actually their interests as individuals and their interests as a class are actually kind of opposite. And this is why capitalism lurches from crisis to crisis. And that actually an understanding that comes from that understanding of the labour theory of value. Okay, so I can see I've only got a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to move on to, well, politically, what does this mean? Why does this matter? Well, I think the main lesson of understanding the labour theory of value is that capitalism is inherently exploitative. Yeah, this is absolutely at the basis of the relationship between us as proletarians and the capitalist class, is that we are being exploited. If you have to sell your labour to live, you're being exploited. And it doesn't matter really if your employer is nice to you. You know, if you feel that actually you get a reasonably decent wage and you get treated reasonably well, or if your employer is kind of, you know, is actually okay on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I work for a charity, they're actually quite nice, you know, so I don't feel exploited in my day-to-day work, but I am being, because I'm working for a capitalist employer in a capitalist system, and they're getting my surplus value. So it's kind of it's a structural thing that's completely separate from actually how we might feel about our work, which is really important, because I think you can get into a thinking where obviously if people are being paid below minimum wage and they're being treated very badly, obviously they're being exploited, but not everybody is. In fact, no, everybody is. And this is true actually even if you don't work in directly productive industry. So like, you know, I work for charity, I don't actually produce a commodity. But the costs entailed in that sort of non-productive work, like state administration, stuff managing the circulation of capital, like working for banks, or things like that are actually sectors that are involved in the reproduction of labour, like say teaching or something like that. All of these are ultimately the deductions from surplus value, because surplus value is the only thing that creates, you know, profit in the economy. So ultimately somewhere, if you're paying more to have, you know, children go to school and be taught, if you pay teachers more, if you pay the NHS workers more because you need your workers to be healthy, ultimately the price that you're paying for that is going to come out of surplus value somewhere. So there's a reason in the economy to keep those costs as low as possible. So even though those workers aren't working directly to produce commodities, their wages are still coming out of surplus value. So they will be exploited just the same as workers in productive industries will. And this is that David Harvey points out that the conditions of exploitation of living labour in these unproductive activities can be as vicious, and in some instances even more so, as in production. So that's true. So you can't make a distinction between people who work in factories and people who work in the NHS or in teaching or whatever. We're all being exploited. So we're all working class. It's not the case that you're working class if you have a northern accent and you work down a mine, and you're middle class if you have a London accent and you don't. You know, we are all proletarian, and that means our interests are the same. You know, and there's no reforming capitalism to get out of this. You know, sometimes we kind of think if we can just make capitalism nicer, you know, get away from the growth mindset and just be kinder. But no, actually, it's not that there aren't immediate demands about, you know, struggles in particular industry to increase wages and improve conditions and so on, because obviously those are very important. But ultimately, the exploitation is built into the system. So as I said, it's not that there's nothing to fight for within the system, and that's quite the opposite. And this is sort of the thought I want to leave you with, because I can see I've gone over. It's the point about labour power. And the thing is that phrase is really important, because thinking of it as labour power, that sort of shows us that it is actually a political relationship. So it reveals the social relations. So this is what Dominic Alexander says in The Limits of Keynesianism Counterfire book, which I really recommend to all of you if you haven't read it. So he says that the term labor power it shows the potential for productive power whose realization depends on a struggle between labor and capital over how much value the latter can extract from the former in return from a given quantity of wages. So that's the point, that all of this is predicated on them being able to exploit us. And this has always been a source of the source of struggle. So, none of this is actually the way that capitalism works is fixed, but within that, there are huge fights over, how long the working day is, how much you get paid. And really, I mean, the absolute final thought, when I was working on what I was going to say today, so I was looking at, rereading various bits of Marx and so on, and all of his examples that he uses for calculating, how much you might be paid and surplus value and so on. It's all like, say a weaver works a 12-hour day. And that itself, that difference that I was being, well, I'm not going to say 12-hour day because most people don't work 12-hour days anymore. It's 7 or 8 hours. I mean, that difference is because generations of workers fought for a shorter day. So, we can push back on this because, okay, they exploit us, but their value ultimately only comes from our labor. So they can't actually do without us ultimately, and that gives the workers power. So I think while recognizing that the exploitation is fundamentally part of the system, and we won't get rid of it until we get rid of the system, we actually have immense power to fight back against capitalism even within the system, which is why the day-to-day struggles, the trade union struggles for rights, for conditions, for better wages are incredibly important, even while we fight to get rid of the whole thing. And I'll leave it there.